So we're going to go ahead and get started. I'm Ceil Strauss. I'm the state floodplain manager, and I'll be presenting today on regulating, grading, and different structures and small sheds in the floodplain. Basically, the items that are not the bigger structures. And Gary Bennett, my assistant, will be helping us out today. He'll be helping to watch the chat for questions and helping me with the logistics. So welcome everyone. Your mics should be muted. At the end, we should hopefully have some time for Q&A and you could unmute yourself, but we ask that you keep things muted and use the chat if questions come up during the presentation. If they're timely regarding something I'm covering at the time, we'll cover those questions then. If there are other topics, we'll talk about them at the end. And we will stick around. If you've got questions, we'll stick around past 10:30 if people have additional questions when we're done with the formal presentation. So I'm going to turn off my camera at this point and start the presentation. But we're talking about the other kinds of development and not focus so much on the bigger buildings today. So that's all kinds of grading, road crossings, those structures like decks, gazebos, fences, solar facilities, pools, all those kinds of things. And we will spend a little bit of time talking about the smaller garages and sheds. Now, a reminder that development for the floodplain, things that require a permit, according to the federal requirements here, this is 44 Code of Federal Regulations, that all types of development require permits. And they define development very broadly. And we added the emphasis here, but it's any man-made change to improved or unimproved real estate. So of course that includes buildings, but it also includes other types of structures, any kind of mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, excavation, storage of equipment and materials. It's very broad. So what kind of permit is up to the community. If you have building code, there's of course certain things that are covered by your building permits, but otherwise you might call it a floodplain permit, a zoning permit, a land alteration permit. You know, what you call it is a local decision, but you need some type of permit. And also, if this is something that you wouldn't require a permit for normally, if in the floodplain, it's something that we're saying that requires a permit, you could consider waiving fees or having very reduced fees. The typical permitting process is these main steps. Is it in the floodplain? Is it regulated? Then which zone is it in? Which floodplain district? Does it meet ordinance standards? Looking at whether what's being proposed meets those standards. And then doing some kind of inspection or documenting it was done according to the permit and your ordinance at the end. So the first part is figuring out, is it an area that's regulated by your ordinance? And I'm going to go through a little bit about the regulation, about the mapping here. We do definitely cover this more in depth than some of our other trainings, our floodplain basics, our FEMA map basics. But FEMA has a bunch of different zones, A, V, D, B, C, and X. We're going to be focused on the A zones. Those are basically the 100-year floodplain, the 1% annual chance floodplain, and those are the zones that your ordinances regulate. If in the future, in St. Louis County, we'll have some velocity zones or some coastal zones. So we won't talk about that today. The other zones where it doesn't require regulation is zones D, B, C, and the shaded or unshaded X. So just being aware that those are other zones. Then within those detailed areas, and I wanted to mention that zone AE, that's a place where we've got a detailed study. There's an elevation on the FEMA map. The older versions had numbers, and then there's other types of A zones, the overland area where they show a depth of the flooding, And then the AHs are more ponding hole type areas, and they also have a flood elevation on the FEMA map. A zone A with nothing behind it is a zone that's mapped as floodplain, but FEMA doesn't show any flood elevations on their maps. Within those detailed study areas, so zone A with the elevation on the map, we're dividing it into the floodway and the flood fringe districts in your ordinance. The other main zone in your our district in your ordinance is called the general floodplain, and that's going to be our zone A and the detailed study areas where they haven't mapped a floodway. So to give a few examples of what this might look like, if you've got older maps, you'll have the dark shaded areas that are the zone A or AE, and the area that's cross-hatched like this will be where they've determined where that floodway is. And we won't get into details on how floodways are determined today. We do cover that in other trainings, but in general, that's the area where we have deeper, faster flows, and we need to keep those open and not obstruct those areas during times of flooding. And the flood fringe is the area that's still within that zone AE, but is outside of the floodway. On the newer maps, the coloring's a little different. The floodway is this red and blue crosshatched area. So the crosshatching in general is usually where the floodway is on the official FEMA maps. And then we have the flood fringe is that lighter blue area. And again, you'll see the zone AE in this example. And we won't go into depth about these other zones, but the shaded zone X or the light gray in the older maps is a medium risk area, usually the 500-year area. Some of our communities do regulate that. If your ordinance regulates that, then you're going to be also looking in those areas. In the 100-year or the 1% annual chance flood is what's regulated, where we've got detailed studies. They usually also calculate the 10-year, 50-year, 500-year. And in some of the newer studies, they get the 25-year and something called the 100-year plus. But for regulatory purposes, if you're meeting the minimum state and federal requirements, we're focused on that 100-year or the 1% area. And again, some communities do regulate up to the 500-year or the 0.2 annual chance flood. And I've already used a couple of these synonymous terms. The 1% annual chance flood is what we try to use officially. The 100-year is what we traditionally use, but we try and stay away from that because people tend to think if they've had their big flood, they're good for another 99 years, and that's definitely not the case. FEMA will refer to the base flood elevation, or BFE. In the state regulations, you'll see the regional flood referenced. And when you're talking with lenders or agents, a lot of times they talk about the special flood hazard area, which is where if a building is located in that 100-year area, that special flood hazard area, the flood insurance is mandatory if they have a federally backed loan. And in general, we'll call it the high flood risk area. So what do these look like in your office? If you've got the older maps, you'll have most likely a tan colored flood insurance study, and you'll have a flood insurance rate map. And if you've got older maps, you might also have a floodway map. So if your maps are older than about 88, you'll have two maps, and they both need to be used together to figure out where that floodway versus the flood fringe is, and to calculate your flood elevations and what your minimum elevations are for lowest floors and levels on the structures that need to be flood-proofed and have flood-resistant materials. Then as we get into newer digital maps, we start seeing aerial photo backgrounds on the panels. They still have a flood insurance study. If they're one of the earlier digital maps, they'll have this old-fashioned looking boat rescue picture there. And the index will look more like this. There is a digital layer available that FEMA calls the DFIRM database. But as we've gone forward with the digital maps and updating maps, we've gotten better maps. The first digital maps, they basically just took the shape that was on the paper maps and did a digital capture and put them in the digital format, but they didn't make any effort to follow ground contours. But as we've gone on, we've got LiDAR starting around 2008 to 2012. We've got that statewide. So the more recent studies, they did have the data from these planes flying and able to figure out the ground elevations, and they're delineating better. But many of you will have maps that are older and don't follow the contours very well. But if you've got the newer maps, the cover of your flood insurance study will look more like this. Your index will look more like this. And your maps will have the more modern colors I was mentioning, the red and blue crosshatched area, the light blue for the flood fringe, the zone A. Here's an example where they haven't determined the floodway, but it's shown as floodplain. And again, those medium risk areas if you regulate the 500 year. And a reminder that with the newer maps, they were usually using the NAVD 88 datum, whereas the older maps, they were using the 1929 datum. And this is a reference point. It's kind of like the difference between Fahrenheit and Celsius with temperatures, that they're not changing the elevation, they're just using a different reference point. And the change is most extreme in the northwest part of the state. And so this can be really a big difference. You want to make sure you're using apples and apples when you're looking at what is on your map for those elevations versus what the surveys are showing and what you're seeing in the field. So the general floodplain, as I mentioned, is that zone A and the detailed areas that don't have mapped floodway. So here's an example of a zone A. Notice there's no E behind it. And there's no elevations. There's no floodway shown. Some of the more recent efforts, we've got models that are backing the zone A's, and we have these cross sections available on a site I'll refer to later, our lake and flood elevations online site, or you can get the cross sections as a digital layer and have that available. So at least we've got the base flood elevation estimates. We don't have floodways though in those situations. And just to give you a perception of how wide the A zones are, it's very common throughout the state. Our detailed studies are really focused in the metro area, the Red River, along main rivers, but most of the state has these A zones. So it's important to know what kind of flood zones you have in your community. The other situation that I mentioned is detailed studies that don't have a floodway. Here's an example. The Mississippi River here, of course, is showing a floodway in this example. But this tributary, they do have a detailed study. You can tell that because we've got the base flood elevations here, but they don't show the floodway here. And also in looking at where do those regulations apply, your ordinance says it applies wherever FEMA's mapped it. So in this example, we do have a high spot, and you're still regulating that area because your ordinance says, hey, any place in the FEMA mapped area is regulated by our ordinance. Now, in this case, it'd be easier to say, oh, yep, even if they have a basement, they're going to be meeting our minimum elevations. But that is regulated. But state law also says if you've got areas that are adjacent to the FEMA mapped areas and they're below the flood elevation, they're below the BFE, you're still regulating that area. And for those of you that have older maps and the maps that don't follow the contours well, we have the resources. We've got the LiDAR, these 2-foot contours to be able to see these areas. And there is language in the model ordinance that talks about that. It does come from this Minnesota rule that where there's a conflict, that you go with that elevation. That's basically saying where you see a situation like this, state law is giving you the authority in your ordinance to regulate that area, actually requiring you to regulate that area. Looking at our sample permit application forms, we do have a version that's longer. It gets into more detail for buildings. Today we're going to focus on our simplified version that is intended for these other kinds of development that don't involve buildings here. One of the first things you're doing then is you're looking to see it. Well, I should mention that the first page is in our sample application form, and this is something you can choose to use. We have it available on our website, or you can use your own forms. But many communities have asked for samples, so we did develop this sample and updated it just a few years ago. And the first page is intended for the applicant to fill out. But then in our sample form, we have a section to be completed by the zoning administrator. So this would be the second page. And the very first part of that second page is getting at verifying, is it in the floodplain where I'm regulating, where my ordinance regulates? And in this example, we're saying yes. And then the next critical question is, what zone am I in? And in this example, we're saying we're in the flood fringe. And is it allowable use in that zone? When we're dealing with buildings and some of the structures we're talking about today, we'll need to know what the regulatory flood protection elevation is. Again, this is something we get into more in other trainings, but it's basically our flood elevation plus any stage increase due to creating or determining where the floodway is. And then we have a minimum freeboard in the state of a foot. So you add those together to get what's called your regulatory flood protection elevation. That's going to be the lowest floor for buildings, but we're also talking about making sure that things are flood resistant and utilities are elevated above this regulatory flood protection elevation. As I mentioned, the two main datums that we use are the 88 and 29 datum. Sometimes you've got some local datums there. And then you want to know what your source was for this information. If you've got detailed studies, it's going to be your flood insurance rate map and the flood insurance study. And if it's not a detailed area, a lot of times we'll have our pink lines, our base flood elevations based on those supporting models, or other might be getting information from your stormwater plan, from the watershed district. Sometimes you need to reach out to DNR and we look for other data that might be available and help you out with that. So again, that's needed for some of the things we're talking about today. Then the next step is, does the proposed development meet your ordinance standards? And the critical ones that apply to all projects and that are really the biggies for the types of projects we're talking about today, in our model ordinance, they're laid out in section 4.3. Most of these come from the federal code, 44 CFR 60.3A, that third section, and then state rules are added for a couple of these. The structure or whatever it is that you're putting in the floodplain is anchored, so it doesn't go floating downstream and become an obstruction. That you have flood resistant materials, so it doesn't basically disintegrate and become another part of the obstructions, debris in the floodplain during a flood. So we're looking at anything below the regulatory flood protection elevation should be flood resistant materials. Certainly things like metal, plastic, some treated types of wood. FEMA does have a document, Technical Bulletin 2, that goes into more details, but for the most part, it's pretty easy to determine whether it's flood resistant materials and pretty common sense. We want to make sure that any filling, any grading is not blocking drainage and not restricting the flood carrying capacity, including for tributaries and drainage ways, that someone filling in their yard is not blocking the drainage in that area and causing water to go onto neighboring properties. That, and along those lines in general, that any grading is not pushing water onto neighboring properties and increasing flood potential damage in those neighboring areas. That utilities are either elevated or they're flood proofed so that they're able to function during times of flooding and you don't have leakage or infiltration into some of those utilities, like the septic systems and things like that. State law gets into more about the storage of materials and not allowing anything that's flammable or explosive, potentially injurious to humans, animals, or plants, or likely to cause pollution. And then we've got some general erosion and sedimentation control language in there. So these apply to every project in the floodplain. And in our sample application form, the second part here, after you figure out which district it's in, is exactly what I just went through. And it's got a place for you to look at, does it meet each of these requirements? Some of these things are only going to be applicable for the small buildings and the structures we're talking about, these highlighted ones, but others are going to be something you need to look at for every single project in the floodplain. So getting into some more specifics about kinds of projects, grading, filling, excavation of any type is something that needs a permit. And typical things we might be looking at: parking lots, trails, roads, driveways, patios, mining, berms, elevating an area. This looks like a violation. A lot of the pictures we've got actually come from violations. We need to get good examples of where people have done filling or some of the structures that we're showing here. But if you're doing filling in the floodplain or grading for any of these kinds of things, that officially requires a permit. Certainly culverts and bridges require permits. And another example would be stream restorations, bank repairs. Those require permits. Now, if there is a DNR public water work permit for the same project, very little of it's above the ordinary high, it's all going to be covered by that DNR permit, then you're not required to have a separate community permit. And we do have language in our model ordinance clarifying that you don't need a separate permit. The communities do get a chance to review the DNR permits. You get a copy of that, so that can count as your permit. But if there is no DNR permit, the community must require a permit. So the examples would be if it's not a public water. In this example, this blue line is the public water and the yellow is the floodplain. Well, here we've got an area in the floodplain and it's not a public water, so that would need the local permit. The other situations where it might not need a DNR permit would be because it is within a less than a 5 square mile drainage area, or they're replacing at the same elevation, an in-kind replacement. Jean's asking if a DNR public waters work permits issued, are the DNR officials reviewing the project for floodplain compliance? They're supposed to be. They're supposed to be looking at whether it meets the allowable rise or no rise, whether it's blocking those things. But that's something that when they're reaching out for local comment, that especially if you've got any higher standards, if you can make sure that you note those, and that our DNR area hydrologists who are working on those permits are aware of any higher standards is important. But again, they're supposed to be looking at those things. It is one of the requirements for getting the permit. In addition to talking about allowable rises in the public water regulations, it does specify it's got to be compliant with local shoreland and floodplain regulations. So where are some things that you don't have to require a permit? FEMA does have guidance, and they say no permits required for insignificant uses that would not have impacts on flows. And they give the example like planting a garden or planting a bush or a pitcher's mound. But that really is not the most solid guidance sometimes. I give the example of if you're hauling a bunch of bags of topsoil in the back of your van, and these were some bags of soil that we got for my house when we were putting a little bit of extra fill next to the house, getting a positive flow away from the house. That's a minimal amount of fill. One minimum you could consider that's a nice solid one is that in shoreland areas, it does specify if it's over 10 cubic yard in shore and bluff pack zones that a permit is required. So I'd say in the floodplain, at a minimum, if it's over 10 cubic yards, you should be requiring that floodplain permit. So here's a couple more examples. Here's a situation where they're just kind of trenching in. This is some like a hose for irrigation. So that's one where I'd say no, that they're basically leaving the same cross section. They're not really changing the grade there. But you get into this situation that's over 10 cubic yards. You got the Bobcat there. You got more major grading going on. You should be requiring a permit if that's in your floodplain. Again, in the flood fringe district, if it needs a permit, you're going to look at those things that apply to all projects in the floodplain. So especially looking at that localized drainage, that if they're doing filling near the boundary of the parcel, that you're making sure there's adequate room between where the fill's going on and that neighboring property. Maybe you need to ensure that there's some swales or something, but that you're not directing the fill toward the neighbor, and that you're not filling in natural drainage ways and causing floodwaters to back up further upstream on that drainage way. Now, if we're in the floodway, it's much more stringent. We still have those standards that apply in all the project areas, but we also have to certify that filling is not causing an increase, it's not causing a rise in the flood elevation. And we need a no-rise certification. Normally that's going to be completed by an engineer, a professional engineer, but sometimes other standard engineering practices can be used, like if they're got documentation that they're restoring it to the cross section that was there earlier, like on a water course restoration, bank restoration. Sometimes we've got evidence either in the models or based on photos or other information. We can say, yep, I'm just restoring it to what was there. With LIDAR, we can do that in some cases. If that's, sometimes we can make a determination. And when you're looking at those other standard practices, that's one where it's a good idea to be talking it over with your area hydrologist or with the DNR floodplain staff. Make sure we're seeing it the same way, and we agree that that's an area that, yeah, we can say this is something that doesn't need a separate no-rise certification, but the default is usually going to be that you need to have that professional engineer do the no-rise certification. This is a copy of the sample no-rise we've got on the DNR page. And if they can't show no rise, if it's going to cause any increase, then federal regulations say they have to get a conditional letter of map revision. And that is an extensive process. It usually takes about a year to go through the process. It costs a lot of money. It will typically be in the like $10,000 range just for the application fees, not including your engineering. From what I understand, the engineering for these things can be in the 30,000, even more range once you put all those costs together. So I don't know of any situations where individual landowners have gone through this process. So the next part on the local official part of the permit application form is, if it's in the floodway, we do have a section here with some reminders. Is it an allowable use? Have they determined it won't cause that increase, either for in the floodway that it's been done by a professional engineer, or you've got documentation that I was just mentioning where they're restoring it to what it was there before, and they can document that. And if they can't do it, that they've got the conditional letter of map revision. And then too, if it is below the ordinary high, does it involve a DNR permit and or utility crossing license, and has that been obtained? So looking at the general floodplain, that's where we don't know where the floodway is. So in general, we'll say, if you don't know where the floodway is, you treat the whole floodplain as floodway. And so they have to meet the floodway requirements. And if they do get an engineer to figure out where the floodway versus the flood fringe is, then they can look at the appropriate part of your ordinance. If they figure out this is part of the flood fringe, then they can be following the flood fringe requirements. And we do talk about this in dealing with Zone A training on March 6th. But on lakes, a lot of times we do have, like in this example here, this is big lake, it happens to be Waconia. And if it's a big lake, Most of the area next to the lake, we know that during times of flooding, we don't have flows. We don't have velocity there to worry about. So in our sample ordinance, we do have some wording that says, if it is a lake situation, you can consider above the ordinary high to be flood fringe. Now, there is wording about it shouldn't be near where there's a tributary or outlet, or it's not part of a flowing system. So like in this example, this is the floodplain, and here we've got, this is officially a lake, but that's obviously part of the flowing river system. So that would still need to be treated like a floodway, or like Lake Pepin on Mississippi River. So part of the flowing system, you can't just say above the ordinary high is flood fringe. You need a more careful evaluation. Or on the lake itself, most of this we're going to be able to say above the ordinary high is flood fringe, but certainly by these inlets or outlet areas, here we've got detailed studies coming in or going out. Near where those are coming in or going out, we certainly are going to treat that as flowing areas. Or here we've got a tributary or outlet. I'm not sure what it is there, but in those areas, we can't say above the ordinary high is considered flood fringe. But on most of the lake, you can. And where a lot of your development is, for many of you, it is going to be above the ordinary high. And you can say it's flood fringe area where you can use the flood fringe requirements. And if it is in that zone A, that in that general floodplain district, doesn't have mapped floodway, that they have to show that it meets the allowable rise. Allowable rise is you get the engineer to make sure it doesn't cause more than a half a foot increase in flood elevations. And state law says that you can't increase flood damage potential. And we interpret that as it's not impacting any existing insurable buildings. So buildings with at least 2 walls and a roof, basically. And you'll see I took this out of our Minnesota Quick Guide, and I'll have links to the Minnesota Quick Guide in a couple places and use examples from here several places. So on the application form, if you go to the 3rd page of that sample form, we have a spot looking at developments in the general floodplain district and have some questions for you to look at and verify, did a professional engineer do the analysis and make sure it's not causing more than that half-foot rise and it's not increasing flood damage potential? Or did we find some other accepted engineering practice to determine this? So we've got a few little areas of guidance on our sample form to help you look at the right things and make sure that they're meeting the floodplain regs. So let's move in talking about other kinds of structures. So we're not talking about our main buildings, but again, all development needs a permit that includes these other kinds of structures. And for sure, that's going to include things like decks, gazebos, solar facilities, pools. And you might have seen some other things. I'm going to have some pictures of gazebos that one of the local officials provided to me, hoop buildings, and some other things that you might have seen and been a challenge on how to deal with them. And I wanted to remind you that tanks, propane tanks, they are regulated in the floodplain based on FEMA requirements. The FEMA definition of a structure specifically talks about tanks, gas or liquid storage tanks, and that they need to be anchored well. And preferably they're above the regulatory flood protection elevation, or you're making sure that they are not allowing leaking, or that they're not buoyant during times of flooding. And this is something FEMA's really pushed on. A few years ago, after Katrina especially, they had so many fuel tanks and tanks that were floating around and bashing into buildings. So FEMA's really tried to crack down on making sure people remember that tanks need to meet those requirements. We don't want them floating around in the floodplain during times of flooding. Decks are another example of structures that need to, well, first of all, they need to meet all the setback and shoreland requirements, but they are things that need to be getting permits. And there's all kinds of creative decks that we're seeing here, and a lot of them I think are being overlooked on whether they're meeting floodplain regs. So this looks like it's not necessarily anchored. These things should be anchored, and they're probably flood resistant materials, but something you want to make sure. This looks like a violation here, and I can see that's our area hydrologist, Leo, who was retired a few years back. But any kind of deck, whether it is, I know that many of your communities won't normally regulate decks unless they're over like 30 inches or some minimum elevation above ground. And for floodplain purposes, it doesn't have to be above a certain height. Any structure like this should have a permit. And again, we're looking mainly at, is it anchored? Is it flood resistant materials? Is it meeting your other setback shoreland requirements? Here's an example of more of a, I guess I'd call that a gazebo type structure. And just showing how during floods, you don't want that floating away. You don't want it falling apart, becoming an obstruction downstream. And here's some gazebos that one of our officials in Stearns County provided to me. And for these, well, okay, you're looking at setbacks and other shoreland things, but then from a floodplain perspective, you're making sure that it's the flood resistant materials. So boy, are those post flood resistant? Is it anchored well? If we're in an area where it's where we're going from open sided and more of a gazebo type of structure to more of a building, you're getting into gray areas here with this solid wall here. But if you didn't have a nice size opening, we'd be looking at that's really getting into a gray area, whether that's allowed and where it's allowed and whether it's meeting minimum elevations for anything that's considered habitable. So when is no permit required for some of these structures? FEMA's in their guidance mentions things like putting up a mailbox. We've got the picture of just a flagpole, so very minimal cross section to that. Those are the areas that we'd agree, yeah, you don't need to require a separate permit for those. But how about you getting into some other things? Here we've got a free little library. Well, that's basically the same as your mailbox post. So you could say, no, that doesn't require a permit. But getting into some of these other things that are in the floodplain, and especially this example's in a floodway, that's a pretty big structure. I don't have anybody standing next to it, but it's a really big structure. It's much bigger than a mailbox or a free little library. You get into some of these things that are utilities. And here's a nice example where they did elevate this utility. So this is on the Mississippi. This is one that I think Nicole Lehman provided. And so they are nicely elevated. They got a little platform to be able to work with it. And they looked at, this would have been in a floodway area. So they're making sure that it's not causing rises and that kind of thing. Here's another example where I'm not even sure what that is, but you can see it's nicely anchored with those concrete supports there. So a couple nice examples showing there that they're elevating, or here they've got this elevated nice and high. Now fences are another one that sometimes throw local officials. So when do fences need permits? Well, FEMA back in 2004 or 5 was telling us we needed to require permits in our model ordinance. And we pushed back, we got some pushback from one of the first counties that needed to update their ordinance. Well, come on, we can't be regulating all the farm fences. And we looked in our state law, in our statutes, and found a definition of farm fence. So in our model ordinance, we basically use that state statutory definition and said, if it met this part of that statutory definition, it's basically posts with some wires, that it would be exempt from needing a permit. But other types of fences, certainly if they're a solid privacy type fence or brick or stone and mortar type fences, those need permits. And even things like the chain link fences, they need a permit because they're can be obstructing flow. And the main requirements, the anchored flood resistant materials, if it's in the floodway, you need to be making sure it's not causing a rise. And here's an example. Many of you have seen this before. River's over here. Area Hydro's taking a picture because this is an illegal structure here, but got a nice picture of this fence, this chain link fence that's perpendicular to the flow. And you can see that all this debris got caught in the netting, and it was the flows were strong enough it actually bent it over. So you need to be looking at what that fence is doing and what kind of obstruction it is, and making sure it's not causing problems for the folks upstream. Solar facilities. That is something that certainly is becoming a more common thing that you're seeing, especially in our rural areas. And we do have some guidance considerations for siting solar power facilities near lakes and rivers. Most of this guidance is getting into more detail for shoreland, but we do have a little section where we talk about floodplain. So you need to be meeting shoreland setbacks. We specify that this is a structure that should not be in the floodway. And if you're in the flood fringe, it is allowed, but you want to make sure it's anchored. You've got the flood resistant materials below the regulatory flood protection elevation. We specify that these panels and any controls should be above the regulatory flood protection elevation. And in the FEMA guidance, they even specify in the tilted position. So you look at what's the lowest that panel could be, and making sure that that would be above the regulatory flood protection elevation. We do have a page in our floodplain management quick guide and talk about that the solar panels, when fully tilted, are above the regulatory flood protection elevation. And we have a link on that page to this document I was just showing here. And by the way, we will be providing PDFs of the slides, and we've got a lot of these links that are linkable in the PDF that you can look at. Another one that comes up is pools. Well, here we've got an in-ground pool. Does that require a permit? Definitely. And in our shoreland folks would remind you that, gee, that's just disturbing just as much as a house with a foundation. So you need to make sure that that's meeting the shoreland setback if it's an in-ground pool like that. But how about this little temporary pool? In most cases, that's not going to be requiring a permit, but I understand some communities do require local permits if it's over a certain height. I'm assuming that's a safety thing. So from a floodplain perspective, you could say it doesn't need a permit, but there might be other local requirements. And we did do a separate article back in July of 2020 in our Water Talk newsletter. So we've got a link to that. And that was an article that was written by someone who was a floodplain guru at the national level and brought up a lot of good points about pools and meeting the floodplain regs at the national level. And we do have a page in our quick guide that summarizes some of these things that we're talking about, that, well, pools, that they can be in the floodway if with a conditional use permit, but that's pretty rare. Usually by the time they're meeting their setback, hopefully they're in the flood fringe. We do need to look at any fencing or pool houses. They still need to meet separate requirements. And we're getting to see more of these hoop houses or hoop buildings. And usually they're going to need a floodplain permit, unless it's something like, in the spring, a lot of the like Cub and the big box stores, they'll throw up temporary buildings where they're selling plants and the things in the spring. Well, if they're just out for a short time, or they're up just for like the state fair or a county fair, and they take it down during most of the year, then you're not looking at the floodplain regs so much. But certainly a lot of these are more permanent, and you need to be looking at are they in the flood fringe? Are they well anchored and flood resistant materials, and if they have any utilities that they're elevated. So moving on, saying a little bit about small garages and sheds. I'm focusing on those that are less than 576 square feet. So here's a picture of a garage that if it's only used for parking and storage and it's less than 576 square feet, they can choose to do the wet flood proofing. And here's an example. This was one that I saw Jean's on here. This is her picture showing that they've got the automatic openings, and we'll talk about they've got to be within 12 inches of the ground, and she verified it was. But the other example I want to bring up is smaller buildings, that many communities don't think about those smaller buildings because if they've got building code, the really small buildings don't need a building permit. In the floodplain, they still need a permit. So you may not call it a building permit, but it needs a floodplain permit. And you still need to be looking at the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Oh, and in the floodway, we're very limited on the kinds of buildings that we're going to see. It has to be accessory to open space or accessory to navigational purposes. There's only a couple things that in state statute or state rules are allowed in the floodway. This is the most common example. We're going to see it's well anchored here. They've elevated their utilities, and they've done a no rise certification or the allowable rise certification if it's in a general floodplain. So this example is on the Crow River in Watertown, and we've got this nice photo during a flood when you can see that the ice is still out there. It's nicely anchored. The utilities are above the water. But in general, for these buildings, they are only used for parking and or storage. They're less than 576 square feet. And if you think that's a weird number, it's because it's 24 by 24. FEMA has used in some places a 600 square foot guidance, but for many years FEMA's allowed us to say for up to 576 square feet, you can do the wet flood proofing. And they need to have flood resistant materials up to the regulatory flood protection elevation. So you're looking at, is it metal? Is it plastic? Is it some kind of wood that has treatment and won't disintegrate in floodwaters? You're not looking at particle board or plywood or some of these things that they get wet for a day and they're mush. You don't want that in the floodplain. The utilities, which typically should only be electric. If I'm seeing something like water or other utilities, then I think their true purpose is habitable area, and this cannot be a habitable area. It does need to be anchored, and you need the automatic openings on at least two sides of the building. The reason for that is so that as the water pressure builds up on the outside of the building, that it equalizes here and you get equal pressure on both sides so that it doesn't burst that foundation or burst that building due to that extra pressure building up. You need the opening within a foot of the ground, and the openings, you need 1 square inch of automatic opening for every square foot enclosed. So if you've got 576 square feet, you need at least 576 square inches equivalent of openings. If they're using some of these engineered ones, those are usually certified being the equivalent of 200 inches. So then you need 3 of those on your 576 square foot garage. And if you got non-engineered things that you're looking at, then there is this guide where they show a bunch of different kinds of grates and openings and what the equivalent opening size is, because you can't count all these things that are obstructions. You have to figure out just the opening portion. And FEMA does have a technical bulletin 7 that gets more into wet flood proofing requirements. But one last point I wanted to talk about was inspections and as-built documentation. And this is a part of the presentation I'd like to get more into for the other types of projects. We have FEMA elevation certificates that we strongly recommend being used for buildings. We do have a DNR sample as-built form, but I really could use a few good examples of how you're documenting other kinds of structures, and what alternatives there are. For smaller structures, you could probably, you're able to show, based on, from the LiDAR about what the elevation is. You can usually, with some pictures, or pictures with yardstick or tape measures, show that they're meeting the right requirements. Or preferably, you're doing inspections, and the level of documentation is highest if you're in a floodway or if it's an actual building. But if you're in a flood fringe area and it's a little bit of grading, then your documentation is less onerous. You're maybe a quick inspection, you can verify that they built what they said they were going to build. Or if you're in a county where it's tough to get out to all these sites, you might require enough photo evidence that you can see that they did what they said that they're doing. But that's an area that, if any of you guys have some good examples of how you document that, would appreciate examples. We do have a few communities that require escrows up front when a survey is going to be needed. And then if they provide the survey at the end, then they get their escrow money back. But if they don't provide the survey, then the local government uses that escrow money to hire a surveyor and do the survey that's required for the documentation. That is both a federal and a state requirement to have the documentation that they built it in accordance with what was in your permit and consistent with your ordinance. There, I think I've just got a few useful resources, and I'm at the end of the official presentation. I see Jean's got a question about a seasonal tent for a winery. Does it need to meet setbacks from the ordinary high and be above the RFPE or BFE? And if it's only up during the summer months? Boy, that's a good question about the setbacks. That's something I think I need to reach out and get Dan Petrick's opinion on how he would look at that for shoreland regs. For the floodplain, that you can have floods that come quickly, that if you were in a place where most of your floodplain was adjacent to a major river and you had plenty of warning time, you could look at maybe allowing it seasonally once you're past that spring runoff season. But in counties where you've got a lot of, or you might treat things differently depending on where it is in the county. But if you're next to a flashier stream or on a lake that can come up pretty quickly, you need to have some assurance that they can take it down before the flood occurs. Or I'd be especially concerned if it's in a floodway. I wouldn't want to see it in a floodway, even if it's during the summer months. So that'd be a very site-specific thing that I would look at. And Jean, if you got a specific example, we can look at that offline here.
Regarding Jean's question, I think you answered it well, but I think it comes down to the fact that it's seasonal. If it were temporary for a weekend, someone wants to put a canopy up because they've got a wedding, I think that's allowable as a temporary structure. But yeah, you raised some good points with those seasonal tents.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. The things that are up for, a lot of communities will have certain weekend that they have events and they'll put up some temporary things. Or actually, I've got a great picture of, they pulled in basically on a trailer a little building that they're selling coffee or treats out of during that community's weekend event. And then that's something that's definitely seasonal, and they can easily hook up and pull off the site if you do get a flood or storms are coming. And the tents, I gave the example of those seasonal ones for selling garden supplies in the spring. Putting up a tent for a wedding or a graduation party, that's another good example where you could allow that seasonally. But a winery, they probably have a longer summer season, so you'd want to be looking at that more closely. So that is what I had in my presentation. So thanks everyone for attending.
Thanks everybody.